Good afternoon and welcome to this event from the Brookings Center on Regulation and Markets. My name is Sanjay Patnaik and I'm the director of the center. We have assembled today's event with some of the foremost experts in their fields to discuss one of the most important policy questions of our lifetime. The world just lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, with more than 7 million reported direct deaths globally, more than 775 million reported cases, and more than 14 million indirect excess deaths. The death toll is likely much higher because in many countries the reporting systems are incomplete. This is the same magnitude of casualties as World War I. Despite the devastating effects on people and economies around the world, we still do not know with certainty how SARS-CoV-2, the virus causing COVID-19, emerged. The two most likely hypotheses are either a natural spillover from an animal host or a research lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the Wuhan Center for Disease Control. Finding an answer to this question is not just a matter of doing justice to the millions of victims of COVID-19, it will have significant ramifications for policy implementation to help prevent the next pandemic. The pandemic was by any measure a black swan catastrophic risk event. However, despite the magnitude of the pandemic, it is shocking that to this day, no country in the world has pursued an independent, comprehensive, and unbiased investigation into the origin of SARS-CoV-2, 4 years after it emerged in Wuhan, China. A major reason for this untenable situation is the fact that the Chinese autocratic regime from the very start suppressed information about the origins of SARS-CoV-2 and has blocked any attempts at pursuing an independent international investigation on the origins question. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that we can or should stop looking for the truth. It is not acceptable that in our democracy, elected leaders have not taken all necessary and available steps within their own domains to conduct a thorough investigation of how SARS-CoV emerged, although a large bipartisan majority of Americans want to get to the bottom of this issue. And although Congress passed a unanimous bill demanding to classify any and all information related to the potential origins investigation with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Biden administration only released a 5-page report to comply with the requirement in the bill, which clearly doesn't include all the information that the administration has on this topic. And similarly, the prior Trump administration also did not provide relevant public information that could have shed more light on this issue. During the current election season, none of the presidential candidates has made the origins of SARS-CoV-2 a campaign issue, and currently, while we are making some progress in the low-profile investigation in the House, and there's a newly announced bipartisan investigation in the Senate, which might yield results down the line, these efforts are not nearly enough. Our citizens deserve the truth, even if it turns out to be geopolitically inconvenient, or it might cause uncomfortable questions for public health officials or scientists. And while the discourse on the origin of SARS-CoV-2 has become highly polarized and divisive among policymakers and scientists, it is really essential to bring the discourse back to an objective and dispassionate, evidence-based debate that only focuses on finding out what really happened. This is particularly important in order to improve transparency around this issue and to ensure the credibility of scientists and public health officials, which we all rely on. Our event is an important step in elevating the need to have an independent investigation into the origins question, and in the second panel, in highlighting why it is so important for policy efforts to prevent a future pandemic. For instance, if SARS-CoV-2 emerged through a spillover from an animal host, then we will need to develop a much better international early warning system that can detect such threats early and help countries contain outbreaks before they spread globally. If SARS-CoV-2 leaked from a lab through scientists who performed experiments on viruses, then we need to take a much harder look at how to regulate such research, whether the benefits outweigh the risks, and who the responsible parties are if something goes wrong. Knowing how the virus emerged would go a very long way in helping steer our limited public health resources into the right channels for investment. For today's event, we purposefully invited a range of experts with different areas of expertise, not only on the origins of SARS-CoV-2, but also on biosafety and biosecurity, to discuss how important policy measures to strengthen biosafety are. We believe that on the issue of origins as well as on the issue of biosafety, it is essential not to only hear the opinions of scientists, but also of other experts, including forensic experts, investigative experts, and journalists. There is a nice analogy. When a plane crashes, the investigative team not only consists of mechanical engineers who built the plane or their co-workers and collaborators, but also a broad range of independent outside experts. The same approach is needed for examining the origins of SARS-CoV-2. In fact, a lot of new information that has come out over the past 4 years about the origin of the virus was in response to the diligent work of investigative journalists, the submission of FOIA requests, and even some efforts of amateurs who have uncovered previously unpublished information. This underlines the importance of approaching an objective investigation into SARS-CoV-2 from a holistic and interdisciplinary perspective. So today's event will start off with a fireside chat on why this issue is important for public policy, followed by a well-balanced panel of outstanding experts on the origin of SARS-CoV-2. Finally, we conclude with a panel of experts on biosafety and biosecurity. And as expected, the experts today have a wide range of views and often disagree on some of the essential questions we will discuss today. I want to thank all of them for being here today and playing an important role in fostering a healthy and respectful debate. With this, I would like to introduce our two speakers for the initial fireside chat. We have Alina Chan, PhD, who is a scientific advisor and viral vector engineer at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, and she is a recent Broad Ignite Fellow and Human Frontier Science Program Fellow with background in medical genetics, synthetic biology, and genetic engineering. She investigated problems relevant to finding the origins of SARS-CoV and also co-authored a book on it. We have a second speaker, Alison Young, who is an investigative reporter and the Curtis Hurley Chair in Public Affairs Reporting at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. She has spent 15 years investigating lab accidents and also wrote a book on it. Alina and Alison, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So let me start with questions for both of you. Maybe we can start with Alina. When we look at the origin of SARS-CoV, why is it important from a policy perspective that we get to the bottom of how the virus emerged? Maybe Alina, you want to take it first.
Well, Sanjay, like you've said, the cost of this pandemic have been staggering. Just looking at the US alone, we're talking at least 1 million dead from COVID, hundreds of millions of infections, people's lives changed, lots of people struggling with long COVID and mental health problems arising from the pandemic. And experts have estimated that this pandemic is going to cost the US $16 trillion. So for context, that's half of the national debt. So of course we have to investigate. And there are 3 reasons to investigate. The first is that to prevent future pandemics like this, you really need to understand the types of risk and the types of mistakes that led to this pandemic happening. And the second reason is that you need to deter future behaviors or acts of negligence or terrorism, people intentionally or unintentionally causing such pandemics again in the future. And the last thing is to really find closure, finding resolution. Like for a pandemic of such scale, it's really something that should be taught in textbooks, in the future, like people all learning, understanding why this happened and how it happened and how governments are acting to prevent it from happening again. So when people say, oh, it's not important, it has no policy implications, I'm like, you've either not thought this through carefully, not thought about the impact of this, or maybe you don't want to find out the answer because the outcome could be very unpredictable. Not just geopolitically, but for someone's field, let's say they are in the business of virus hunting, virus discovery, it would change that landscape entirely. Or for a small number of people, it directly impacts them. They are implicated somehow in the activities that might have led to this pandemic starting. So I would say that there are tremendous consequences for finding the origin of COVID-19.
And I think you bring up a good point, right? Whenever a big accident happens, and this is, as you say, a really catastrophic one, if we just look back at Chernobyl, for instance, then we take measures, we find out what happened, we put in new safety measures, etc. And so that's a good point. Alison, over to you. Same question.
I would echo many of the things that Alina just said. We can't change what we don't know what happened, and there's an issue of public trust that is involved here. You mentioned some of the statistics. I mean, a majority of American adults believe that COVID-19 came from some sort of a lab accident. If it did not come from a lab accident, we need a credible independent investigation showing where it came from. And if it did come from a lab accident, the absence of a credible independent investigation is going to continue to tear at the trust issues that the public has in scientific institutions and in government. So trust is one of the really important things for why there needs to be an investigation. And I would also say, it is human nature that there are those who would say there's no reason to really figure out how this pandemic began, because we can right now take actions to address the various issues that are believed to be at the core of the two plausible hypotheses. We can address issues relating to the wildlife trade. We can address issues of human encroachment on natural habitats. We can address pandemic preparedness. We can address biosafety and biosecurity issues. But we all know that it's human nature to avoid making significant and politically difficult changes when there is not compelling proof that it is absolutely critical and urgent to do that. And I'm coming at all of this question from the perspective of a journalist who has spent all of these years investigating lab accidents at US facilities, some of which are considered the most prestigious and considered to be the safest in the world. And yet they've had all kinds of very serious safety breaches, to the point that the US Government Accountability Office, which has, going back more than a decade, been warning that the proliferation of biological research around the world, the more of these labs that are being built, and more of them are being built because of COVID-19, the more of these labs, the more research that occurs with dangerous pathogens, the greater the risk of a catastrophic accident. And this is coming against a backdrop of a research enterprise that has fragmented oversight at best when it comes to safety and security. And it is largely self-policing. And I'm sure we will talk more about all of that.
No, this is very important. And I think, going back to Alina's point, we also at the same time see increasing encroachment of humans on the natural habitat around the world, right? Like bringing animals closer. So we have a lot of the interactions there as well. So let me ask you, and maybe Alison, you can start. What is really puzzling to me is, how is it possible that we have not had a credible independent investigation into the origins of the virus in any major country in the world? Okay, the autocratic regimes, I understand, they don't have any interest. Especially in China, they want to suppress the information. But in a democracy where elected leaders are accountable to their constituents, and this is, this is one of the worst catastrophic events we have experienced in our lifetime. How is that possible?
It's pretty mind-blowing that's where we are at this point. It's obviously extremely difficult to investigate an outbreak that occurred in a country that will not allow an independent, credible investigation. But that doesn't mean there should be no investigation. And I think one of the things that occurred with COVID-19 that's incredibly unfortunate is that from the very beginning, the very obvious question of, is it possible that a lab accident occurred in Wuhan, which was a center of coronavirus research for the entire world and far away from the natural reservoirs, the natural known habitats where the closest coronaviruses were known to be found, that this very obvious, simple, non-political question was made political. It was branded as a racist conspiracy theory. And there was framing that the only people qualified to do any investigation of the origin of this virus were scientists. And not just scientists. Sometimes the debate was framed that only certain kinds of scientists, only certain virologists who have certain backgrounds. And none of that makes any sense. I mean, as we get 4 years away from the fog of the emergence of this absolute catastrophe on the world and on so many people's lives, that never made any sense. And as you said in your opening remarks, there are many disciplines with many different skill sets that are capable of contributing to an investigation of where COVID-19 came from. And yet they were not tapped in early on. And that is something that was a huge loss. I will say, and I'm speaking with my journalism professor hat on at the moment, that I think another reason that there has been the failure of independent investigations is that you had this sort of toxicity that surrounded the question of could it be anything other than nature that caused this pandemic, and the news media, I'm sad to say, really failed in doing its job. With few notable exceptions, too many major news organizations failed to do their own independent and credible investigation looking into how this pandemic began. And while news organizations regularly labeled the lab accident hypothesis as a debunked conspiracy theory, reporters, again, with some exceptions, failed to report on the backstories and the potential conflicts of interest of some of those who were seeking to put forth a narrative that said that a lab accident hypothesis was not worth investigating. And so I think there are many, many reasons why there have been no investigation. And I think that actually that's something that we all ought to be reflecting on, is why we've gotten to this point.
No, I think you bring up a good point, especially also going back to what both of you said earlier, which is about trust, right? We see, unfortunately, in a lot of democracies, trust in institutions eroding, in government, in media. It shouldn't be like that, right? Like we have a stronger system. We have a system of accountability. And so, Alina, same question to you. How is it possible that we haven't had an independent, especially independent and unbiased investigation? I know you have been one of the very few voices that have been calling for this from the beginning, and you have taken a lot of heat for this as a young scientist. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I think Alison explained it really well. And that just add that I think of all of the countries, China probably has the most urgent need to find this origin, if they have not already found it. That is because for them, it's a huge national security risk. Like, think of what China has gone through in the last 4 years because of the pandemic. They've locked down their most major cities. Just life has ground to a standstill for a lot of people. It's hurt them economically and politically just around the world. Their reputation has fallen a lot. There are all these accusations of bioweapons and lab leaks. Like, this is a big deal for China. And it is in their absolute interest that they find out how this happens so that they can prevent it from happening again and again and again, whether from a market or whether from a lab. And so there's no doubt that China has been standing in the way of a credible, independent investigation. Just from day one, they've been penalizing journalists, healthcare workers, doctors, anyone daring to question just to find out whether this is spreading human to human, whether or not there's an outbreak even. We know that there were some heroic doctors like Dr. Li Wenliang and Dr. Ivan who were harshly punished. Like, Li Wenliang lost his life to COVID-19. He was forced to sign confession letters on about the same day when one of the companies in China started making like wartime levels of vaccines against COVID-19. And the government already had the COVID-19 sequence even before he was made to sign a confession letter. So there are so many of these examples where China has stood in the way of information and of an investigation. So what do we do in this situation? Alison said it already. The US, as a leader of the free world, has to investigate. If the US is not investigating, who is going to do the investigation? I know that the WHO tried to do an investigation in 2021, but it was an absolute failure. It was not even called an investigation. The WHO said it was just like a collaborative exploration journey into Wuhan. They were controlled every step of the way. They were not shown even the lab where the coronavirus research was done. And so why is it that 4 years on, nothing has moved? There's so little evidence that's available. Everything is still circumstantial. I agree with Alison that, one, it was politicized and polarized very early on with all these accusations of racism, despite the fact that if you compare a wet market spillover and a modern lab doing cutting edge research, like which is more racist, which is more xenophobic or xenophobic? I actually think the market thing is worse. Like, the market thing, painting Chinese people as uncivilized, bat-eating barbarians, versus they're doing research that's so cutting edge that's causing pandemics. I actually feel that the lab is less racist than the market. So there's that. And then also the fact that we know now from all these subpoenas and freedom of information requests that there were several prominent scientists who were coordinating these letters and campaigns to shut down any discussion of a lab origin of COVID-19. They told us it was not plausible. They said it was a conspiracy theory. This intimidated a lot of other scientists and prevented them from speaking up. I have so many colleagues who said, we can't even say something like this. And this continues today. Even today, I have colleagues who are like, I can't say anything about this. It's going to tank my career. And what good is it going to do for me? So really, I think that the whole thing, all of this, the conspiracy theory label and the scientists intimidating each other, it prevented anyone from moving forward and investigating a lab origin of COVID-19.
And actually, that's the opposite of what science should be, right? Science is open inquiry and asking questions and asking difficult questions. I mean, one thing that I worry most about is, and that's regardless of whether it's a market or kind of like a natural spillover from a natural host or a lab leak, is what precedent that sets for countries in the future not to be forthcoming, right? Because if we basically let China get away with it, that they don't have to be forthcoming, the next country that has maybe a natural spillover and has a disease outbreak, they're not going to say anything. It's going to spread out of control, spread globally, and we'll have another pandemic again. And the same if there's a lab accident. And so one question I have is that when we look at the time, right, it's been 4 years basically. I still remember the time like in March 2020 when the US shut down. It's been a long time. Is it still possible to investigate the origins? A lot of data probably has been lost, has been destroyed. If so, what information would be needed? And more importantly, who should lead such an investigation? Maybe Alina, you can start.
Yeah, so absolutely, an investigation should happen as soon as possible, actually. I think, doors are closing. So after 4 years, so many of these doors have closed. Like people's memories are faded. The ability to collect evidence has faded as well. But we still have to investigate. And if you look at the current collection of evidence, it's like looking at a humongous giant puzzle of which many of the central pieces are missing. And many of these could have been collected in 2020, but now a lot of them are out of reach. Still, we have to go and collect those pieces that are still available. So what we have right now,
Can you give
in
an
the
example
absence,
for pieces? Yeah.
so
still
a
available.
lot of these are like interviewing people on the ground. So at the time, there were many people, not just Chinese citizens, but US citizens and international citizens visiting Wuhan in late 2019. So a lot of them should have been brought in, including doctors. Like US doctors were in hospitals in Wuhan, like working there on exchange and that kind of thing. They could have been brought in immediately for interviews, for testimonies, just to map out the timeline of the pandemic. Even just to know, was the first case in October or was it really only in December that you saw the first patient? So it's something that critical was not even done. And furthermore, many of the Chinese scientists and doctors at the time were sending messages overseas, not only to their friends and family, but even to journals. And that has not been done. No one has gone through all the medical and scientific journals asking them for the manuscripts and the data that might have been sent or deposited, but later retracted or rejected or not published. So there's a wealth of information that still could be obtained even today. But I'm saying that memories have faded. These journals and organizations might start deleting emails. It's 4 years is a long time to have delayed this investigation. And so what's happening right now is that you have this giant puzzle piece, and most of the pieces are missing, and you have proponents on both ends, both natural origin and lab opponents, in the absence of evidence, just sketching out the most extreme scenario possible. And that's really harmful to the public. And I think it is very deeply irresponsible for both the media and the scientific journals to be conveying this impression that the case is closed, that there's overwhelming evidence for one or the other. We don't need to investigate anymore. We shouldn't investigate because the chances are so low. I think that's really a sign that they've given up. Not just they've given up on finding the truth of origin of COVID, but they've given up on earning the public's trust.
No, this is a great point. That's what I think I find very frustrating about this, when you hear policymakers say, "Oh, we might never know the origin, and that's why let's not do anything." I mean, that's not for a catastrophic event like this. I don't think that's a very productive attitude. At least we can turn over any stone that we still can turn over for is afterwards, and then we see where the chips fall, right? Like we see what comes out, and then we can weigh the different evidence for both sides of the debate. Alison, same question for you on the investigation.
Obviously, getting on the ground and getting the firsthand information out of China is what everyone is wanting and looking for, and that hasn't happened. But there are, in a digital age, there are footprints that are left in so many different formats, and we have started seeing those tidbits of information, threads of information that have come out. And again, through an enormous amount of work. The National Institutes of Health, which was involved in some funding with some of the research that was done in China. I mean, it has taken not just the Freedom of Information Act for some journalists and nonprofit groups. Nonprofit groups have done the work that frankly, some major news organizations should have done. But it's been freedom of information lawsuits that have forced the US government to release emails, and there have been some of the hearings that have released Slack messages and other information about grants and drafts of grants and things that were written in them. So there is information. It's not the mother lode. It's not the sort of we're going to find exactly what happened, but it is circumstantial evidence that gets us closer to trying to know what was going on at labs in Wuhan, at least for investigating that side of the origins question, that there is that kind of documentary evidence that is out there. But I would say that, you know, it's instructive. It may take a long time to find out what happened here, whether it's on the natural origin side or on the lab side. And as I was researching some of the sort of long history of lab accidents, one of the cases that I think is pretty instructive is that in 1979, there was a really horrific outbreak of anthrax in a town in the former Soviet Union, Sverdlovsk. And this was a case where US intelligence agencies quickly suspected it was an outbreak that was tied to an accident at a bioweapons research facility. And let me just say right here, the US intelligence currently does not believe that there is any bioweapons connection to COVID-19, but nonetheless, this was a biological facility in the former Soviet Union. And there are so many parallels to what happened then that I think we can learn from now. The Soviet scientific officials adamantly disputed the allegation that it was some sort of a research or lab related accident. They said it was from people eating contaminated meat. The Soviet scientific delegation that came to the United States did an elaborate presentation in Washington, D.C. at the National Academy of Sciences, where the Soviet scientists showed these elaborate autopsy photos showing that the outbreak victims died from gastrointestinal anthrax. And high-profile US scientists rallied around their Soviet colleagues, praising their candor and publicly promoting the false narrative for a number of years. And the bottom line is it ultimately took 15 years and the collapse of the Soviet Union for the truth to come out that this outbreak had been caused by an accident that sent an anthrax cloud over that city. And so I think the lesson to learn here is that if COVID came from a lab accident, there very well may be individuals who have saved evidence that could still come out in the future.
So I think the parallel that is really the most striking here is that is two autocratic regimes. I think that's what we have to keep in mind, right? This is not a democracy. They have to save face, and even in democracy, sometimes it's hard to get at the full information that you need. But in autocratic regimes, they basically control all information. I think that's a very critical key that is often overlooked in this debate. I want to actually get to Alina on something related to this. When you look at kind of like a lot of the data that has come out, that has been used on both sides of the debate, with, as you say, with I think with confidence that is often misplaced. Do you believe that the data that is coming out of China on early SARS-CoV cases, on the animal market, especially on the timelines, when I know there has been a lot of debate on the wet market, which was actually much later than what a lot of the original cases already seemed to be happening before, is that data that can we trust that data at all? It's coming from an autocratic regime. They have an interest in not being fully open and fully transparent, or is that data that we can still learn something from?
I think I'll echo what Alison said, that there are likely people who are holding on to evidence right now, and it's not safe for them to come out. So it's really about the passage of time, right? Just waiting until things change, country is safe to come on and say, I knew that it came from so and so,
Okay.
and I have this piece of knowledge that I've had like under my bed or in a USB key somewhere.
So
But
like kind of like a whistleblower that would be willing to come forward and if the circumstances are right. Okay.
And I'm sure there are people who know. Like this is such a big issue that I highly doubt that it's a complete mystery to everyone living on Earth. So I think back to your question, I don't think that there's anyone sensible who would say that we have the complete data, the complete like truth
Yeah.
coming, all of the knowledge that's available to the Chinese government. I don't think all of that has been released. I mean, even the strongest proponents of a natural origin will say as much. And this is a quote from one of these leading proponents to the Washington Post. He said there are probably at least 10 times more cases that we haven't sampled because
I
only
see.
something like 6% end up in the hospital. So, but he assumes his assumption that's not based on any data. He says we fully expect the cases that we don't sample, the cases they don't know about, to come from exactly the same geographic distributions as the ones we do sample. So what he's saying
Okay.
is that he thinks that the data shared by the Chinese government is the same as all the data they're not sharing with us, and even the data that they don't know about. So this is completely unscientific. And we know from many examples that there are harsh consequences for sharing this type of information, knowledge about early cases, the situation in Wuhan. There's even one citizen journalist who has been in prison for 4 years because she went to Wuhan. She was a lawyer at the time. She went to Wuhan and started just filming on her phone and talking to international journalists, and she was imprisoned and tortured. Like she's in prison for 4 years. And I don't even think that she knows the origin of COVID-19, but she's been punished
Right.
to such a degree just for asking the question in China. And so do I believe that we have all the data that the Chinese government has? Absolutely no.
And I think that that's an important issue to raise because oftentimes when I look at the debate, I think people like really being on both sides, kind of like swinging insults and like saying that people are in bad faith. But what we have to remember is when you're a scientist in China, regardless of whether you have information on like the natural or the labic origin, you cannot speak openly about it if the government doesn't want you to, right? Like that puts you in harm's way, that puts your family in harm's way, and most people would probably not risk that. And I think that's very different from how we live here. And a lot of people, I think, don't realize that difference, right? Like if I have a scientist here at the university, they can speak out, they can say whatever they want to on this topic. They can at least provide some of the evidence. They don't have to fear for their safety or their family safety. In China, it's not the same, right?
Well,
Alison,
I mean, I would say
yeah.
that even in the US, you do have to fear for your safety. And I've heard some of these, examples, right? Like some of these scientists who are partners of the Wuhan lab have received death threats and all sorts of things like powders sent to their home and stuff. It's very dangerous. But I think that danger is like 1,000x in China compared to what it is in the US.
Yeah. Alison, I want to turn to you, kind of like taking a bit of a step back when we look at biosafety, right? And we have three outstanding experts today on the second panel talking about biosafety, which I think is something that obviously is on top of mind or should be on top of mind for many policymakers. I think right after what we saw, for instance, after Chernobyl, we saw what can go wrong if there's a nuclear accident. And then people started thinking, well, we might have to make our systems more resilient to this, right? Same with what happened with Fukushima. Now we saw what one virus can do worldwide and wreak havoc across the world, economically, politically, and then with lives of people. And when we look at like biosafety and biosecurity and kind of like the measures we take, obviously it's also very important to look at lab safety. And even if COVID did not come from a lab, if it came from a natural origin, I think just the way a potential pathogen could wreak havoc if there's an accident is something we should think about, right? And so when you look at the history of lab accidents, you've researched it for 15 years. You've really done a thorough job, and you're an expert on this, one of the few in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of like what the history looks like in the US and around the world, and what we can learn from this, and also especially what we can learn from this for policymaking related to biosafety and biosecurity?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a number of things. I think just to start off with on the policymaking side, I think that one of the things that the public doesn't realize is that there is no universal mandatory regulation of safety, biosafety when it comes to biological research. We don't even know how often accidents are occurring or how often lab-acquired infections are occurring. There is no mandatory universal requirement for reporting those things. There is this patchwork quilt that the GAO has been warning about for some time of various oversight mechanisms, often tied to different funding sources, and then a limited number of labs working with certain kinds of pathogens that come under regulation. But even that is pretty limited. And there are issues relating to the potential for conflict of interest in the United States in those limited oversight bodies, because the groups that oversee biosafety in the United States tend to be at places like HHS, the CDC, NIH, and the US Department of Agriculture. And in every single one of those cases, those are organizations that fund the research that they are potentially overseeing and engage in it themselves. And my reporting over the years has found numerous instances where the CDC, the USDA, the NIH, these are organizations whose own labs have had very serious biosafety breaches. So, I mean, you have that, and you also have the situation that people need to realize that it is not a far-fetched situation to have an outbreak coming from a lab accident. You have the case of the 1977 flu, which circulated the entire globe, that appeared to be a virus that had been frozen in time from around 1950. And that has been widely viewed as being some sort of research-associated incident, potentially from a vaccine trial. You have the first SARS virus. The first SARS virus, after it was brought under control through extraordinary public health measures, that virus escaped from labs multiple times due to lax biosafety. In one case, setting off an illness and a small outbreak where a researcher traveled on a train to the south of China. You had another very experienced researcher who stuck his head inside a biosafety cabinet without protective gear, and himself became infected. So, I mean, there are so many ways that accidents can occur, and it's because human beings are involved in research. Human error is a constant, as are a number of issues when it comes to breakdowns in some of the safety mechanisms, the mechanical issues, and the safety equipment that is used.
I mean, I think it's what you say highlights the need why we have regulation, right? We have regulation for a lot of high-risk activities. We cannot have you cannot build your own nuclear reactor in the basement without regulation, right? And there's a reason for it. And I think what is interesting is, with a lot of the advances of new technology we have seen in biological research, I don't think the regulatory regimen has kept pace with it. And we'll talk much more about this in the second panel today. But I think this is one of the areas where we have observed that, and there are many other areas in the US where we see that, where regulation is far behind the markets or far behind what is happening by researchers. Alina, I want to kind of like last question to kind of like wrap up. Two things. One is, as I said earlier, you have been one of the few voices really calling for independent investigation from the beginning, for an objective, unbiased. This has not been easy for you. And so I'm curious, kind of like, you have looked at both scenarios and you have looked at the evidence and about these different theories. Where have you landed and what's your level of confidence? And then second, maybe if you can just work that in there, there has been a lot of debate, I think, in the community and on both sides about conflicts of interest among scientists, among others, right? Like, for instance, if you collaborate with someone in the Wuhan Institute, you should disclose that probably before opining on potential origins. And oftentimes that hasn't happened. So I'm curious, kind of like, what your thoughts on this? How can you deal with those? And are there other scientists that don't have any conflicts of interest related to this that you can draw on?
Well, that's a lot to answer in 5 minutes.
That's
I'll do
fine.
my best. So, I mean, both natural and lab origin scenarios have a spectrum, right? So on the natural side of it, the most popular one is that there are animals at this wet market in Wuhan that infected people. That's the most popular one. But there are also some scenarios where a person who's infected elsewhere in China or Asia travels by high-speed train to Wuhan and starts the outbreak there. So there are scientists who favor both of this. Even Ralph Baric, one of the closest collaborators of the WIF in the US, said that he doesn't think the market is where the thing started. He thinks it was another way that the virus made it to
Interesting.
Wuhan. And on the lab side, it's also quite broad. But the most popular one is that the scientists in Wuhan had genetically engineered one of these viruses, causing them to become more infectious, and that caused the pandemic. But it also could be a huge range. So it could also be a natural virus that infected a scientist, whether in the lab or in the field when they were collecting specimens, and then caused a pandemic. So no genetic engineering, just a natural virus. So based on all the evidence that's available, I agree the FBI. I think it's a lab origin with moderate confidence. I can't say strong confidence because there's no direct evidence. Everything is circumstantial. But in my point of view, it's very striking that this pandemic could have been caused by any of hundreds of virus species at any of tens of thousands of wildlife markets across Southeast Asia and China, in any of thousands of cities with populous cities, and in any year. But instead, it was a SARS-like coronavirus with a unique furin cleavage site emerging in Wuhan city, housing this lab where scientists 2 years ago proposed to make viruses, SARS-like viruses with furin cleavage sites. So there are too many coincidences here that leads me to think that this virus more likely than not came from the lab rather than the wildlife market. So what I think about the conflicts of interest, I think that there can also, again, be a whole range of conflicts of interest, right? So let's say the pandemic started in a lab. Who do you blame? Do you blame the technician who's just being told what to do in the lab? Or do you blame the PI of that lab, the person who said do this experiment? Or do you blame the funders of the work, the people who encouraged it, who paid for it, might have told the people to do these sort of risky experiments or rewarded that kind of behavior? Or do you even blame the entire field of people who are doing virus collection and virus discovery, right? So there's a whole range of conflicts of interest here that you might feel blame, responsibility, or danger, personal danger, if it results that this pandemic did come from a lab. So my stance is not to take things at face value, and this was a mistake that was made in 2020. A lot of journalists and policymakers were captured by their sources. So before the pandemic, they already had some friends who were scientists, and they completely leaned on them. Everything they said, they just took it for truth, rather than soliciting opinions elsewhere, especially from people who do not have conflicts of interest. So that mistake should never be repeated again in times of future crisis.
Great. Well, we're out of time for the Fireside. I want to thank both of you for your time and for your expertise and for working on these important issues. And now we're going to move over into panel one, which is going to talk of basically about both sides of the debate on the natural spillover as well as the lab leak. And we have two experts on one side and two experts on the other side. And it's going to be moderated by Antonio Regalado. Antonio, over to you.
Hey. Thank you, Sanjay. Great to be here. We have with us 5 scientists who have actually investigated this case in their capacity as scientists or with government agencies. And so we're going to have a terrific discussion. The subject of the panel is, did SARS coronavirus 2 leak from a lab or spill over naturally? Evidence and policy implications. Everybody has an opinion on this matter. Those opinions are not always informed by the evidence. So I'm excited to dig into what the evidence actually is. Our guests are Jason Bannon, a former FBI scientist who has been retired for 2 years. Jesse Bloom, a professor at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and an expert on viral evolution. Maciek Boni, who is a professor of biology at Temple University and has consulted with states and school boards in connection with COVID-19. And lastly, alphabetically, Susan Weiss, a professor and chair at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, who is in fact an expert on coronaviruses. So it's wonderful to have you. So I want to open it up with a round robin question or set of questions, which is as follows. Tell me, in your field or for you, what does evidence mean? What is your theory of evidence that you have applied to this question of the origins of the coronavirus? And second of all, tell me, what is a single piece of data or evidence that you find particularly compelling or maybe particularly frustrating? Please introduce us to one type of evidence that you've considered. And lastly, I do want to get you guys to say where you stand on the origins questions. Do you lean one way or another? What are the probabilities that you assign? Let's get everybody to let us know where they stand. I would love to start with Susan, if you're ready to answer that.
Okay, so I don't think there's a single piece of evidence, as you mentioned here. what I look at is what I know about coronaviruses, what I know about furin cleavage sites, what I know about the origin of the past two epidemic coronaviruses, SARS-CoV and MERS-CoV. I think that first of all, I just want to say, could we please stop calling the virus COVID? The virus is called SARS-CoV-2 or SARS-2. And can I clarify something that's kind of confusing me? There are three possibilities here. One is that the virus spilled over from an animal into a human in the market, and I would favor that that origin. Secondly, is that it, quote, came out of a lab. It came from a tissue culture dish or an animal into a human. That's still a zoonotic origin. We keep calling it lab leak, but it's still zoonotic. And the third one is that somebody either manufactured this virus or manipulated this virus. I find those almost completely impossible for what we know about coronaviruses and how you manipulate viruses. So I thought that was off the table. I thought we're arguing now about whether it came out of the into a human, into the market from an animal, or whether it somehow infected someone in the lab. If we have to argue about whether it was manipulated, we can argue about that. So for me, the evidence has to do with where we can find viruses. If we could find them in the animal in the lab, if we could find this virus or evidence of this virus in animals in the market, that would be very good evidence that it leaked over in the market. If we could actually find this virus in the lab, which we cannot, as far as I know, there is zero scientific evidence associating this virus with the lab and with any lab in Wuhan or any other lab before the pandemic happened. So for me, it's all circumstantial and speculation or suspicion or political to say that it came out of the lab. As far as I know, there's zero evidence. The only evidence that would convince me is finding that virus in the lab. And it's been told again and again and again, it's not there. Throwing a furin site you could manipulate a virus to put a furin site into the spike. What I know about furin sites, and maybe you're going to ask me about that later.
I will, yeah. Okay,
well, let's not get into that, but it doesn't make any sense. So for me, I think there's zero evidence it came out of the lab. And given the precedence that these viruses are in bats all over the place, there are hundreds of them in bats. They transmit to other animals, and they have transmitted to humans in the past. To me, it's very strong evidence in the absence of any real evidence that it came out of a lab.
Okay, I was going to call on Maciek Boni next, but I think he may agree with you. I'm not sure. So maybe, yeah, I will. Maciek, can you answer my three questions as well as Susan has? What theory of evidence do you bring to this case? Tell us about a piece of evidence that interested you, and tell us where you lean about an origin.
Sure. So I'm actually really glad we started with the evidence side of this. There's five major categories of evidence that little pieces of evidence fall into when it comes to the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And those are the genetic evidence, the geographic evidence, the historical evidence. Fourth is the evidence on human-animal contacts. And fifth is evidence on laboratory incidents, illnesses, or laboratory inventory that would tell us something about potential laboratory origins. So of these five categories of evidence, the first one that we had a really good assessment of was the nature of human-animal contacts in general in East and Southeast Asia, also specifically in Wuhan. This is the reason for most outbreaks or epidemics that occur in this part of the world. This is the reason that they're typically traced back into animals. And this is the reason that one of the first places that you start an investigation is with the animal populations that were close to the humans that got infected. This, up until the summer of 21, I think this was the strongest piece of evidence suggesting that this was simply a natural origin. And then the other major area where we have strong evidence is now the geographic evidence. And that's the early clustering of cases. So there's 155 cases that are identifiable in December 2019. And those cases cluster around the Huanan seafood market. And as you kind of walk back in time and get to smaller and smaller numbers of cases, they get closer and closer to the market. So for me, these are the two strongest lines of evidence about the origin.
Thank you very much. Jesse, how about you? I know you have wrestled new evidence into being as part of your work. So I would love to hear your answer to this line of questioning as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think as far as what is the nature of evidence, this sort of metaphysical question, I mean, obviously, evidence is anything that helps answer the question that you're trying to answer. And so I think the more appropriate question is how are people from different fields sort of used to obtaining and evaluating evidence? And typically, when you approach a question from a scientific perspective, you typically assume that the data you have are accurate. And in those cases, when you're not sure about the accuracy of the data, you typically try to repeat the experiment to see if the data were in fact accurate. And this is obviously not really possible in this particular situation, because there's obviously questions about the completeness of the evidence. And in many ways, although this is a question that has a lot of connections to science, it's really an historical question. What happened in this one event? There's no, going back and repeating an experiment to see how accurate some piece of data are. So this I think raises a lot of challenges and questions. So for instance, when you go to the first cases, if we just sort of go through the chronology of what, has been variously claimed, sort of the first major paper that came out about the early cases was this paper from Hong Kong University and the Chinese CDC that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in early 2020. And it said that the first confirmed cases were on December 8th and December 10th in Wuhan and were not linked to the Wuhan seafood market. Then there's a paper that comes out a little bit later from doctors from Beijing and Wuhan that says that the first case was on December 1st, 2019 in Wuhan and was not linked to the Wuhan seafood market. Then there are these news articles in the South China Morning Post, or a news article that's sort of not entirely clearly sourced, that says that there were confirmed cases going back to November 17th. Then there's a more formal investigation, this joint WHO-China investigation that looks back over those cases and determines that the first case was in fact on December 8th. But that investigation is then criticized for not making available the full underlying data. And, for instance, the Biden administration, so the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he puts out this statement and says, on behalf of the US government or the Biden administration, we've got real concerns about the methodology and process that went into that report, including the fact that the government in Beijing helped write it. But the Biden administration doesn't release the underlying data, to support Antony Blinken's, contention that maybe that report is not accurate. So I think when you look at this from a scientist and you want to say, all right, what was the distribution of the early cases? How do you know? Like, you have all of these different contentions. And I think for that reason, it's just very unclear. And I think in that sense, in my mind, the most important piece of evidence is that a lot of the things that we would really like to be able to validate, these questions of who were the first human cases, were there viruses similar to this being studied in any labs in Wuhan? Were there infected animals in Wuhan prior to the first human cases? There's no evidence for the second two. There's no evidence of infected animals in Wuhan prior to the first human cases, and there's no evidence of this virus being in a lab in Wuhan prior to the first human cases. But there's reasons to be uncertain about how complete or accurate the data on either of those points are. And so I think, when you go to the odds, I mean, I'm not a bookie, so I'm not going to try to give odds on this, but I just think it leaves us in this very unsatisfactory position where the typical tools that you would like to apply in the relevant scientific fields are hard to apply because we have problems with both the confidence in the data that's available and the sense that there's probably other information that's not available to analyze.
Thank you so much. We're going to turn to Jason, and I'm looking forward to your answer. I know you're a scientist, but even so, you work for a law enforcement agency, and law enforcement considers other types of evidence, right? The guilty mind, circumstance. You can go to prison based on circumstance and your behavior. So really looking forward to what you have to say here.
Evidence is information. That's what it is. And so when you're tasked to do something like an investigation or an assessment, you look at the totality of evidence and you try to do so without any inherent bias. And that was very hard to do in COVID, because the study of the origin of COVID, because immediately there were rumors flying around and there was inherent bias in the publications that were being presented by scientists, legitimate scientists here in the United States. The bias became political. So it was very, very difficult to assess evidence in an unbiased way. And that's what you're supposed to do in an assessment. And then that bias even spilled over into the intelligence community. We saw it among our colleagues at other agencies and stuff. And so it's very difficult to get rid of that. But you try to do the best thing that you can. And if I were to say, what is the single most important piece of evidence in considering the origin of SARS-CoV-2? There really isn't one. I have to say that with all sincerity, there's not one piece of evidence that I think is greater than another. Again, I go back to the totality of the evidence that you have. And then when you look at that evidence, you give it weight, and you try to do this again without bias, but you have to give the evidence some weight. For instance, the zoonotic theory is based on the fact that SARS-2 presumably SARS-1 in 2002 happened as a result of zoonotic transfer. And so that gives weight to the zoonotic theory right away. Well, we saw it happen before, and we're seeing it happen again with MERS. Unfortunately, if you look at it without bias, we haven't seen any epidemiological evidence of zoonotic transfer in any of the cases of SARS that emerged in Wuhan. It's just not there. And so you have to then adjust your weight to the types of evidence that you're using in your assessment. Then you look at the other scientific evidence that's already been mentioned by Jesse and others. You know, the geographic origin of the virus comes from Yunnan and further into Southeast Asia with this clade of viruses. Put that together with the fact that, well, you're presuming animals were transported over 1,000 miles away, 1,800 kilometers, to be sold in a market in Wuhan, when in that intervening distance between the area where the viruses are endemic and that market, there is a population of about 400,000 people, with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of markets serving that population. And there wasn't one incidence of SARS type illnesses prior to the emergence in Wuhan reported in any of those provinces. And so, you know, you try to put all of these things together and come up with an assessment with some confidence. And so the highest confidence for the laboratory origin was by the FBI with a moderate confidence assessment. And then among the rest of the intelligence community, any that had most were can't make a decision, but in those that were favoring the zoonotic theory were done so with low confidence. And so what I think we need for that last part is what new evidence could increase confidence in our conclusions either way. It has to be full disclosure from the Chinese government. We really, unless we get full disclosure and information, we're never really going to know the truth. And remember, assessment is not proof. We're not out to prove the origin. We're out to make our best assessment of what happened.
Yeah, Antonio, maybe we should be allowed to respond for parts of this to correct a few statements that were made.
Sure, quickly. I see Susan might have something to say as well. Do you? Or
No, Maciej has something to say.
Maciej, perfect.
Yeah, I mean, first, so just a few corrections. The assumption of a zoonotic origin was not at all based on SARS-CoV-1 having been a zoonosis. This is based on the last 27 years of molecular biology following scores and scores of outbreaks that occur all the time that are traceable to animals. The other thing that it's based on is the pattern of human-animal contacts in East and Southeast Asia. This is the reason that the animal investigations occur in the first place. These are things that occur on the scale of millions per day. So this is not an exaggeration for the effect of this panel. This is, you know, lots of people do their groceries in these types of markets. The probability that you're within 18 inches of a live animal in East or Southeast Asia on a Tuesday doing your grocery shopping, that's 20%. So I lived there for 8 years and I did my shopping at these markets, and this is what it looks like. So it's not correct to say that there's no epidemiological evidence linking the origin of SARS-CoV-2 to a virus circulating in animal populations. The genetic evidence is there, the market evidence is there, and also the geographic evidence is there, and it's very strong.
Thank you. I think Susan raised a good point. Which are the theories that we are actually talking about? There is a spillover in a market from an infected animal. There's something that she says is also zoonotic, which would be handling labs, collecting bats and handling labs in a laboratory. And finally, this concept of manipulation, which continues, genetic manipulation in the laboratory, which continues to be out there. So I'd like to ask a question on this to Jesse. There was the publication or the leaking of a document, which was a proposal to DARPA. It was called Defuse. And it was basically a plan for engineering coronaviruses in ways that have some of the same features as SARS coronavirus 2, right? They were working within this family of viruses. They were interested in furin cleavage sites. So that report or that document, the grant proposal, which was not funded, has been called by some a blueprint for making a virus like this. Jesse,
I need to comment on it, maybe after Jesse, but I
well,
really need to comment on it.
This is what people are saying, that it's a blueprint. This is an argument in favor of some kind of synthetic origin.
Right.
My question to Jesse is that what this is?
How about let's let Susan comment first. I'll answer the
Okay,
question.
I'm going
please,
to comment.
please, Susan.
First of all, grant proposals are not public until they're actually funded. So there's nothing suspicious about this, there being a proposal. The other thing is manipulating furin sites I did that in the mouse hepatitis virus 20 years ago. That's something that you might want to know to understand how these viruses work. Thirdly, I just want to say something about furin sites. Furin site, it's just the site where a protease cuts the spike protein in order to activate it. That can happen at many different places. If it happens to have this so-called furin site, which is just a bunch of basic amino acids, it will be cut while the virus is being produced in a cell. If it doesn't have a furin site, it will still be cut when the virus enters the cell. So whether it has a furin site or not just tells you something about the pathway in which it enters the cell. It doesn't tell you it's a hypervirulent virus because clearly the first SARS did not have a furin site. Some spike proteins have been selected and evolved to have a furin site. Some have not. If you look at even closely related mouse hepatitis virus strains, most of them have furin sites, some do not. They're all pathogenic. So this idea that you could, and the other thing is if you take a spike protein and you shove a furin site into it and it doesn't belong there, it may make it a really bad virus. There's just no guarantee that it's going to hypervirulentize or make it hyperpathogenic. That's just a misconception. If you take, for example, if you grow SARS-CoV-2 in certain cell types, it loses the furin site and it grows better without the furin site. So this is all dependent on where it's growing, what it's doing. If you take out a furin site from SARS-CoV-2, it becomes less pathogenic in animals, but it grows better in tissue culture. So this whole idea that it's way too oversimplifying to say that if people are going to shove a furin site into a virus, it's going to make a pandemic virus or something like that. And yeah, to me, it's not really surprising that they wanted to manipulate the furin site because that's what we do. We change these viruses in order to probe their pathogenesis. There's nothing evil or even always necessarily dangerous about doing something like that. It's all done in a BSL-3 lab. BSL-3 labs, at least my BSL-3 lab, is incredibly hot. You have to be incredibly careful. You have months and months to train before you can even get one. But anyway, I'm sort of off topic. But what I want to say is this idea of them planning to put a furin site into a spike protein is kind of ordinary, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a worse virus. So this gets me really anxious because it's really misinformation.
Well, this is the opportunity to correct it.
Clarify.
I find the viral sequence to be, very interesting and special. It can't be censored. It can't be recalled. We
have no idea. If you look at the SARS-CoV-2 genome, nobody can tell me what about it makes it spread the way it does compared to SARS-1. There's no way that evil genius could devise this virus to behave the way it does. We just don't know why. Nobody can evolve viruses like nature can. So I just really object to the idea that this virus has a furin site that makes it so much worse than other.
I think the question is whether this group is ready to rule out whether there's any evidence, any signature of any kind of engineering in this virus. So I'll call on Jesse to answer my question about diffuse and
Yeah.
whether he's confident that this virus
to
has
answer
not been.
to answer your question about diffuse, I mean, first, I think this has been alluded to, and I know people on the panel understand it, but just to kind of contextualize this a little bit more, it's clear that SARS-CoV-2 is related to bat SARS-related coronaviruses, so coronaviruses that naturally circulate in rhinolophus bats that have been found in Yunnan and in other parts of Southeast Asia, like North Laos. And so the question that people have wondered about is, how did this bat virus get to Wuhan and start spreading? Did it get there through an animal? Did it get there through a lab? And were there modest modifications, such as introduction of a furin cleavage site, that were made along the way? So this diffuse proposal is this unfunded grant proposal that was submitted by some US-based researchers that included the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And one of the things that grant discussed was collecting SARS-related coronaviruses and studying them in various ways, including, there was mention of introducing proteolytic cleavage sites at this S1, S2 boundary. So some people have kind of called this a smoking gun. I think that is too strong to say. I think we talked about the limitations of the evidence, and certainly we've talked a lot about how the Chinese government, or I talked a lot about, I think, how the Chinese government has not provided complete evidence. And so one of the ways that people are able to obtain evidence that they think might be relevant to this topic is to sort of FOIA grant proposals that involved US collaborators with the Wuhan labs. And that's certainly relevant, but I think it's important to keep in mind there was a very large body of research potentially going on at these Wuhan labs that did not involve US collaborators. So there's a little bit of a risk of overly focusing on the small amounts of information we can get about specific research projects that's accessible within the US. As far as your broader question, certainly I think the fact that there were the strongest argument against a lab origin is that there's no evidence that SARS-CoV-2 was present in the lab prior to the pandemic. That argument is, I think, the strongest argument against a lab origin. However, that argument is weakened the more that you think that there was active programs at the Wuhan labs to collect SARS-related coronaviruses and study them in various ways, including in some cases maybe modifying them. So I think the diffuse proposal is an example that shows that there was ongoing work at the Wuhan labs that was involved in trying to collect and study these types of viruses. So that means we should somewhat downweight the fact that no one had publicly described a virus closely related to SARS-CoV-2 before the pandemic, because there was clearly ongoing work to study and identify new viruses similar to SARS-CoV-2. That said, in the absence of any evidence that a virus highly similar to SARS-CoV-2 was actually present in a Wuhan lab prior to the pandemic, I don't think it can be called the smoking gun either.
Yeah, thank you. Magic, I also want to ask this question to you about a two-part question. One is, in the prior session, there were calls for different scientists to, divulge everything that they know, all their Nature submissions, their drafts, everything. And in fact, some people have been called before Congress now to testify. I think, given the way you weigh the evidence, what is your view of further disclosures on the part of different scientists that might have been collaborating with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or even who do coronavirus research? I think I've seen even Susan's emails and some of these FOIA dumps. So everybody, there's this investigation into who knew what, a sprawling sort of FOIA investigation. I just wonder if you think that should continue. Is that damaging? Or should scientists just open their inboxes and let people decide for themselves? What's your approach to this?
Well, I mean, very generally, I think all scientists would agree that more transparency is better, more openness is better in science. And the entire scientific community has been moving in this direction for 20 or 25 years. So for open data, open access publications, genomes posted publicly, this has done a great service to science. So all federally funded work, you're required to make your data open to some degree. And there's exceptions if it's proprietary or if there's personal health information involved. But in general, things have been moving in the right direction. And then for this specific topic, yeah, it's better to release information that you might have that might be helpful to this investigation. I don't know what this would be at this moment, because I feel over the last 4 years like we've exhausted most of the sources of information that we could look for. But yes, more openness is, of course, better. Could it be damaging? I'm not sure. I don't think releasing this type of information could be damaging. I mean, the part that's been damaging over the last 4 years is, I think, continuing with these insinuations that the public's trust has been violated, continuing with statements that things are being hidden or that scientists are being deceptive. I think this is the part that's been more damaging in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you, Jason. I wanted to turn to you. There's a case that, my thinking about this was very much influenced. I was a reporter back when the anthrax was sent after 9/11. Someone sent milled anthrax in envelopes to the Senate and to the news media. And it was just very interesting because, from the published literature, you could identify the people who had access to that kind of stuff and had been sending it around before. So it's quite a curious case. And I was just wondering whether this investigation, which I understand you were connected to, the Amerithrax investigation, did the FBI learn anything from the Amerithrax investigation that was relevant to the origin question of SARS coronavirus 2?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say that the approach to the Amerithrax investigation and this assessment of the origin of COVID-19 is yeah, it's not similar at all. The Amerithrax case was initially investigated by public health officials when the first victim presented with respiratory anthrax. But once other cases of illness and death were reported across the country, and the spore-laden letters you mentioned with articulated threats were recovered in Washington and New York City, it was very clear that that was a criminal matter. And so that investigation really then, just it progressed as a normal criminal investigation. One of the lessons learned in that that did help with working on the COVID assessment was that we didn't have scientists capable of really supporting the anthrax investigation in the beginning. And so we had to build programs, and Director Wray mentioned that recently when he was asked about our work on the COVID assessment, was that we built over the last 2 decades programs that include scientists in very many scientific disciplines to support very technical investigations, agents and analysts who have scientific degrees and are adept at conducting investigations. So I think the building of those programs after the Amerithrax investigation did help us in putting together a team to look at the assessment of COVID's origin.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason, for turning the topic to preparation, because we have to get to that bit, the policy implications of all this. We've heard what people think of the evidence. I guess I need to ask each of you as well, what is your prescription going forward? What is the top of your list of prescriptions, either for dealing with the public debate, for addressing lab safety, or the possibility of, zoonotic spillovers? I think we've heard that, this debate has become kind of unpleasant, toxic, but we still could arrive at a place where we have policy prescriptions. What should we do, as Jason said, to be better prepared for whatever comes next? And so I'd like to invite each of you to give us your policy hopes, prescriptions, and we can begin with Maciek, if you like.
So the question is now turned to policy prescriptions for preventing future pandemics. Is that right?
It could be preventing future pandemics. It could be about lab biosafety, or even how scientists talk to one another. What would you like to say? Yeah,
I'll stick to future pandemics. So there's 2 keys. in getting ourselves ready for future pandemics. So one is understanding the circulation of pathogens in animals. You cannot do surveillance for every pathogen in every animal system that you know of that's close to human populations. That's way too much. So what has to be done is we have to build a system that understands the incentives that bring humans closer to animals, the likelihoods of transfer of pathogens from those animals to humans, and the way we can counter those incentives and increase safety in places like wet markets or wild animal farms that reduce all these contacts and then make these types of events even more rare. So that's the first thing. And the second is that over the last 20 years, we have built up these clinical systems with that use diagnoses of unknown origin to identify these types of clusters of cases that in the moment cannot be identified as anything that we know. This was a good idea when it was created 20 years ago, but essentially what's happened is that we haven't followed up to make sure that countries put these in place, that they're standardized, that they're constantly working, and that people pay attention to them. So these two things, that's like a 10+ year project, but that's where, you know, we should land there by the mid-2030s sometime.
Jesse, how about you? What would you like to see happen?
Yeah, I mean, so first, as far as the discussion of sort of this origins topic and the related topics go, I think it has become very acrimonious. But in my view, I mean, when you look at the so-called two sides of this debate, I mean, on the one hand, you have scientists who in general are trying to better understand how outbreaks happen and develop therapeutics and vaccines to help mitigate outbreaks when they do happen, which are very laudable goals. And on the other hand, you have people who are very concerned about biosafety and biosecurity and want to prevent lab accidents that could cause outbreaks that could harm large numbers of people, or prevent even malicious actors from doing things like bioterrorism, which is also an extremely laudable goal. So I think one thing in terms of discussion would be everybody maybe take a deep breath and take a step back and realize that both of these goals are very important. And I think what we should really focus on is just kind of find sensible middle grounds that can advance both of those goals. As far as policy prescriptions, I mean, I think one of the things we certainly learned during the COVID pandemic is that scientists are not always the best people to write public policy and all aspects of everything. But I do think we're not going to be able to eliminate the risks of future pandemics, right? We can do certain things that will reduce the risks of both zoonotic and lab research-related pandemics, but we're not going to be able to eliminate either of those risks. And so I think we should really invest in, approaches and things that have been developed during the COVID pandemic, like fast responses with vaccines and so on, to also be in a position to better mitigate pandemics or outbreaks when they do occur.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to Jason and then have Susan bad cleanup here on this question.
Yeah, I mean, what the real point of studying this is that if the pandemic arose through zoonotic transmission in a Wuhan market or elsewhere, understanding the animal reservoir and the conditions that allowed the transfer and adaptation in humans would allow for mitigation to prevent similar pandemics, especially if this is the second SARS pandemic to occur through zoonotic transfer. If the pandemic arose due to research conducted in a laboratory, well, then understanding the laboratory practices that allowed for the release or occupational exposure and release to the Wuhan population, that should be openly communicated and discussed among researchers to prevent future occupational incidents that have pandemic potential. This is very important. As a former member of President Obama's FESAP, the Federal Expert Security Advisory Panel, during the moratorium on gain-of-function research, we were tasked to look at, are there significant or sufficient rules, regulations, guidelines on biosafety and biosecurity in the United States before the moratorium was released. You can read the FESAP report, it's online, but in a nutshell, we basically said we have a lot of guidelines, regulations, legislation to govern us, but you can't legislate against stupidity. And things happen. And we see this pretty much annually with releases from laboratory and occupational infections and stuff. So we really have to, it's not a question of was it a zoonotic origin, was it a laboratory incident? We have to look carefully at both scenarios to really understand what we're going to do moving forward.
Thank you. Susan?
Okay, I'm not a policy kind of person.
Well-
I don't have a lot to add, but I do have some things to add. So I would say, for one thing, we need to think about data, scientific data, and not circumstantial evidence when we look forward. And it would be a huge mistake to shut down science. I mean, we need to understand these pathogens, and we only understand them by working with them, not by shutting them down and saying they're too dangerous to work with. And I think, as Matcha said at the beginning, we really need to understand what's out there in the animals, what can possibly become zoonotic infections. And just as one example, so MERS coronavirus is not super transmissible from human to human. It transmits from camels to humans mostly. And it's still infecting humans this year. I mean, it slowly continues. But we also have MERS viruses in Africa, in many countries in Africa. They're slightly different clade from the ones in the Middle East. And so far they haven't infected humans, but there's a potential there. It's in so many high percentage of camels. There's real potential there for it to evolve and start infecting humans. So we really have to watch out for the animals, what's going to happen going forward. We shouldn't stop studying these things. We have to understand them better. That's my policy.
Well, I would love to hear your views on this bird flu in the cattle. Now this new, I guess it's a spillover from birds to cows, at least. This is, everybody has milk in their refrigerator, so we have some questions, and there are some signs. The surveillance. How many cows have been tested? There's an agency involved, USDA, great agency, but promotes agriculture. So. Are you watching this bird flu, Susan? And
maybe watching it more than me, Magic. I mean, I'm watching it somewhat, not in huge detail, but I mean, but viruses are everywhere in animals, and they're gonna change species.
Yeah, and just to get your milk question, I mean, just to put in a specific thing, I don't think we need to be concerned about the virus in pasteurized milk, but certainly non-pasteurized or raw milk may contain high amounts of virus. So I would recommend people do not drink non-pasteurized milk.
Live virus.
Ever, but certainly not right now.
Mm-hmm. Matchek, is this something that you are you involved with the this current spillover into cattle?
So not directly, only through sort of background conversations with other scientists. Jesse and I just discussed this last week before this call because we were discussing what types of assays might be helpful in this moment. I think the key now is watching for this one phenotype that the virus may or may not acquire soon, which is a phenotype that allows it to transmit in our to replicate in our upper respiratory tract and become transmissible from person to person. And that requires a well-funded broad surveillance. And so last week, I and a couple other scientists had gotten concerned to a certain point. But then Friday's announcement that $200 million would now be made available for this type of surveillance was welcome news. And I think from now to the middle of June, we have to see if this surveillance network is put in place and if we can get kind of rapid routine assessments of phenotype of this virus to see if we can just track it week to week to see if it acquires, this ability to transmit from person to person.
Yeah, interesting. I think I want to wrap up with, in the background of events like this is a question about biosafety, which really is referring to a lab. So I think the background question is whether laboratory research needs to be constrained in some way. And one of the consequences of the investigation into the origins is that we've gotten a ton of information about research and about researchers in the US. So, who've been working in these areas. So I do want to hear a little bit, even if you think that the origin or that the origin is not a lab, we've learned a lot about research on potentially dangerous viruses. And I would just like to hear what you think this sort of high-tech, high-end virology research, what shape should it take? Are there areas that it shouldn't go? Are there new precautions that should be taken, or is it okay the way it is? That's the last question.
I'm happy to start with that one.
Yeah,
I mean, I
Jesse.
do think that the vast majority of research that goes on in labs, including virology labs, is plenty safe with current biosafety. I think that there's a very small slice of research which involves research with agents that would have the potential to cause an outbreak where those agents then transmit from person to person. That is really research that needs to be, I mean, obviously there's new recommendations that recently came out from the White House, but that need to be really aggressively considered and thought through. So to go back to something that Susan was discussing, for instance, when you talk about, inserting protease cleavage sites into coronavirus spikes, if you're doing that in the context of MHV, which is this mouse hepatitis coronavirus that poses no risks to humans, I don't see any reason why people shouldn't keep doing that. However, regardless of whether or not this diffused proposal has any relevance to the origin of SARS-CoV-2 or not, I would certainly say that inserting these sorts of protease cleavage sites into viruses that might pose a potential risk of causing an outbreak in humans, such as SARS-related coronaviruses, is, in my view, something that should not be done. And I think there's very small slices of research that involve viruses that have the potential to really cause large self-sustaining outbreaks that should not be done or should only be done under very limited conditions. And then there's a vast majority of other research which is just fine. And we've seen this in the past, so for instance, after the Birmingham smallpox outbreak, where smallpox was after its eradication, smallpox was reintroduced into humans, fortunately only caused a small outbreak by a lab accident. There were very strict international rules that were put in place specifically for smallpox because that posed such a unique threat in terms of sort of self-sustaining outbreaks. But that threat doesn't apply to most virological research. So I think we need to draw the lines and think very carefully about where those boundaries should be drawn.
Right. We're turning to a subject which is sometimes called gain of function. It is the most dangerous viruses, studying them in the laboratory in forms that could potentially create a risk that they would jump out and spread. I would love to hear what Susan has to say. Is there a domain of research that you believe, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, that you conclude ought to be restricted, constrained, or do we need our experts working on this?
I think we need I don't think that the pandemic has changed what we should and shouldn't do, because I believe it was a natural spillover. And I think it's important to understand spillover and understand these viruses. So I don't really think that. And just to what Jesse said, I don't think that putting a furin site is necessarily, like I said before, doesn't necessarily make the virus more pathogenic. I'm not sure why you'd really want to do that. Except to understand more about how viral entry works in a real basic science kind of way. So I would not restrict. I mean, I think, as Jesse said, most of the work done in this country is done under BSL-3 conditions, and they're really very strict. I don't think we can control what people do in other countries. Maybe the rules are different in China, for example. I would be way more on the non-regulation side. That it's more important to get information and understand these viruses than to not work on them, like to stick your head in the sand and not work on them.
Jason, how about you, please?
That. One thing you said was you admitted your bias, that you don't think it's lab origin and that you're stating in favor of zoonotic. But by ignoring the possibility of a lab origin, then we ignore the possibility that it did occur in a laboratory that's outside the control of United States biosecurity and bioregulations. And that's where the danger comes from. And so
we can't regulate them.
I think none of the research that was proposed in the DARPA proposal was, evil or anything. And insertion of a furin cleavage site, like you said, is done for legitimate purposes. We want to see how these viruses interact with cells, how they gain entry. Does it affect their reproduction? Anything associated with infectivity of these viruses. That's important. And the research that was proposed and funded by U.S. Funding agencies basically stated, we want to see what genetic changes occur that make these viruses amenable to jump species. And that's important. That's important research. Nobody's denying the importance of that research. But when you're passing viruses on human cells routinely to study those genetic changes through passage, when you're doing genetic manipulations of those viruses to see what happens, and you notice that you had a gain of function that increased pathogenicity, then that's where we get concerned. And the problem with that is in those progress reports to NIH, since this work was done outside the country, what measures did the granting agencies, USAID or NIH, do to ensure that this research was being done responsibly? Because if you look, give me a minute, if you look at their publications and their dissertations and theses and what they report in the grants, the work was done at BSL-2, not what you do in your lab.
But can I just say something?
That's the problem. And by ignoring both sides, we can't ignore the possibility of animal origin. We cannot ignore the possibility of lab origin, because then we're not going to come to any legislation or guidelines that will protect us in the future.
But I just want to say,
Susan, we're just at time, so I'll give you just
I'll
if
just
you
say
make
really-
your point very
really
briefly,
quickly.
and then I'm going to turn
Okay.
to Matt Check
Okay.
to
So-
synthesize and have the final word.
So taking a virus out of a bat, it probably won't grow in a human cell, but if it does, it's not going to become more pathogenic. It's going to become less pathogenic. They lose their furin sites. They become less pathogenic when you grow them and when you passage them in culture. So it's a misconception that taking them into a lab, you're going to hype them up and make them more humanized. It's just not true. The way you're going to get them more humanized is to replicate in a human.
Just saying that's the study, that was the proposed reason for the statement of work in their grants.
Well, it doesn't necessarily.
Can't deny that.
I didn't read the grant because I'm not really that interested in reading
Well, there
it.
you go. You didn't read the grants. You
Okay.
didn't read their progress reports.
No,
Let's
Are you familiar with all of their literature,
yes,
their published literature?
some of it, yeah.
Did you read the theses by Yu Ping and by
Of course not.
Li Peng Zhang?
No,
Well, then you're not as well informed.
Uh,
You need to read those.
I read the
Matt
primary.
Check.
Okay, that's
I mean,
that's
Jason has experience in the interrogation room, perhaps. Matt Check, can you summarize for me your feelings? Maybe summarize some of the thoughts we've just heard about whether there need to be new constraints on what scientists do and what science is?
Well, I'm not an expert in biosafety. I've never worked at biosafety level 3. So maybe I can answer one of Jason's questions about bias from a couple minutes ago. Scientists like myself are not biased naturally to one of these hypotheses. So, for example, I would take laboratory origin of this virus very seriously. If there were incident reports from the laboratory, anything about accidents that would have been reported in November, December 2019, inventory, illnesses, swabs from the floor of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the way that you have swabs from the Huanan seafood market, indicating virus positivity in the hallways or something like that. So these are all things that would make me take this hypothesis very seriously. And until this evidence exists or is presented or comes to light, we really are dealing with a blank space in this area. And all the other evidence in the meantime has stacked up to support the natural, slightly less exciting hypothesis that, like all other outbreaks and pandemics, this originated from wildlife or sometimes domestic animals. So this is where most of the scientific community sits. And then if there's a glasnost moment in China in the 2030s and all this extra evidence comes out, then yes, we will change our minds.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, for giving an hour of your time for this. It's been terrific. And I'm going to hand things over to Matt Field for the next part of this Brookings event.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for sticking around for the second panel. We'll hope it's as lively as the first. I'm Matt Field, and I'm an editor at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And we're here to discuss biosafety and the regulation of virology research. Virology has obviously provided the world with a lot of benefit: vaccines, therapeutics, a better understanding of deadly pathogens. But it's not a field that's without risk. There have been lab accidents in the past. There have been incidences of pathogens escaping containment. And as we heard previously, some people even believe that such an accident could start a pandemic. So we have a great group today to sort of unpack the regulations and policies that guide virus research and strive to make it as safe as possible. We have Jamie Yassif, who is the Vice President of Global Biological Policy and Programs at NTI, Gigi Quick-Granville, who is a trained immunologist and is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and Raina McIntyre, who is a professor of global biosecurity at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And so without further ado, I'd like to just jump in. I think my panel is here, although I can't see them. I guess the first question will go to Raina. Could you sort of talk about the scope of the research that we're talking about when we discuss biosafety and pathogen research regulations? And to just to add on to that, if you could kind of bring a perspective as to kind of how important this research is and the relative scale of it, how much of it goes on and that sort of thing, that would be excellent as well.
Sure. Yeah. So we're talking about a very tiny fraction of virology research, and that includes synthetic biology, around certain types of synthetic biology, as well as genetic engineering, which meets the definition of enhanced pathogens with pandemic potential. Generally, these will be respiratory viruses. And the guidelines in the US define PPPs as ones with high transmissibility, high morbidity, and mortality in humans, but they don't provide definitions of what is high mortality or what is high transmissibility. So there's considerable subjectivity in that assessment. Generally speaking, these assessments will be done by basic scientists or virologists who may not be familiar with epidemiologic definitions of high mortality or transmissibility. For example,
Still on, following, but I'm not. Don't worry, I'm off screen and on mute, so don't worry.
So, a case fatality rate of greater than 1% is high, but someone unfamiliar with how we assess case fatality may think that's low. We often hear, as an example, we hear researchers minimizing long COVID as rare because they might do a study that says 5% of the population has long COVID, but that's actually in the same ballpark as coronary artery disease, which is the leading cause of death and illness in the world. And it's a major burden of population health. So the scope and definition needs to be informed by multidisciplinary expertise. So as I said, true EPP is a tiny subset of virology research, and regulating it better is not going to cause the world to stop turning or affect scientific progress. It'll certainly not affect drug or vaccine development. We have seen some reports in which gain of function and loss of function are conflated. So gain of function is where you're conferring properties onto a pathogen that either increase its transmissibility or its pathogenicity. And we've seen also a lot of documents stating that vaccine research is going to be affected. Now, vaccine research typically uses loss of function research, not gain of function research. And that's where you take a virus, say measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, attenuated live viruses. So you take a virus that's normally pathogenic in a human and you make it not pathogenic. You take away its pathogenicity so you can use it as a vaccine and elicit an immune response that gives you protection against the actual pathogenic virus. Now, I've worked in vaccine research for over 30 years, and I've never seen a vaccine developed using gain of function research. So I think first we have to stop conflating loss of function with gain of function research. And the other thing is that in terms of, we often hear arguments about drug development and vaccine development being affected. They're not affected. In fact, drug and vaccine development has come a very long way in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, it took a very long time to identify appropriate drug targets. For example, you needed to do extensive experimental methods and animal research to identify targets. Now you can do it with AI, just with a computer, in a fraction of the time it used to take. So in actual fact, we've moved away from relying on virology research for drug and vaccine development. And I think the other thing we need to think about in defining the scope of research, we need to think about quantifying the risk of going to remote, uninhabited areas, collecting animal viruses that would never otherwise see the light of day or come into contact with human beings, and bring them to big cities to study them in the lab. So just to summarize, synthetic biology and genetic engineering that meet the definition of EPPP, which will generally be respiratory viruses where you're conferring higher transmissibility or higher mortality, and also perhaps resurrecting extinct pathogens such as variola that causes smallpox.
Thank you. And so I was wondering if any of the others would like to add to that or expand on anything. Gigi?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to talk here. So I think we all want to have vaccines that work, that are effective, but I don't think that you can say that you're pursuing loss of function research when the concepts of transmissibility and pathogenicity are incompletely understood. So I think one of the things that is really important as one thinks about biosafety and how we want scientists to learn it is to make sure that scientists know what they're doing, that they're well trained, that we provide resources for training. And when we think globally, we have to think about ways that we encourage countries to spend money on biosafety, that we pursue biosafety research, that we have twinning programs so that we have we can compare notes on how to best run labs. So these are the kinds of things I think that are really good to raise all boats, because I think the kind of research that we're talking about, or at least I think that Dr. McIntyre was talking about, is not necessarily something that people are pursuing, or if they do, it might be something that is that is not intentional. So I think it's important to think about how we improve biosafety for everyone.
So am I hearing that there's a little bit of a divide in how people in the scope of how big folks think this area of research is on so-called enhanced potential pandemic pathogens, or is that?
So people want to study viruses because they're worried about pandemics. They're worried. They want to understand them. They want to. I mean, this is as we are thinking about with H5N1 and dairy cows, right? I mean, we have a little bit of information that we have because of the work that virologists have put in over the years. We know that there are some mutations that we're concerned about signaling a infectivity in humans or in mammals because of these types of experiments. So we want those benefits, but we have to make sure that we do this safely and with regulation that is appropriate for what we're trying to do. And I think it's important to not make this adversarial, because virologists, I mean, I have been very forthright that we need oversight and safety for this for research that gives us this important information. But it's a matter of having it make sense. You don't want regulations for regulation's sake. You want regulation that actually helps to make the field safer. You want that kind of oversight, and I think that's possible. But you need to have deep expertise in the processes of the laboratory work to be able to craft something that makes sense.
Thank you. And
I'd like
Jamie,
I'd
I was just going to ask you if you wanted to expand on that or talk about how large of a portfolio this work is.
I mean, my sense is the question about the scope of the sort of virology research that warrants special attention. I think that there's my sense is there's general consensus about that there's the broad range of virology and synthetic biology research that we do for all sorts of productive purposes. And there's a small subset of that we need to take a careful look at as part of the pre-funding and the experimental design review processes, where there's a potential to make something that's more transmissible and or more virulent and or other considerations. And we want to make sure, I mean, I agree with Gigi. I think that there is a way to regulate and conduct oversight of this work that balances two needs. You want to allow the beneficial purposes of the research to go forward so we can learn about naturally emerging infectious diseases and have better countermeasures and protections against it. But we will look most carefully at the research that is like the most risky. And we want to make sure that the oversight process is properly scoped, so we don't just like bury the whole enterprise under a very burdensome process. We just really want to narrow the scope of the focus of that extra oversight. I do think the new White House policy on this issue attempts to do that, and I think it does it quite well. And we have an hour to talk about sort of the ins and outs of that, but I'm cautiously optimistic that this is feasible to do in practice. And I think that that's a really good starting point. We still have some work to do as a community to continue to build that out and make it effective.
Okay, thanks. And back to you, Gigi. Maybe this is something I should have asked first, but anyway, it's coming to you now. Could you please, clarify some of the terminology that we've kind of glossed over here just now, and that we hear a lot when we talk about biosafety? That is gain of function research, dual use research of concern, and then the great acronym EPPP, enhanced pandemic potential pathogen.
Well, we have a new acronym too. So the recently released administration guidance that creates two categories of research for oversight that Jamie just referred to. Dr. Yasif, I'm sorry. Maybe it would be easier for you all to go by first names here. But that acronym is called PEP. So that's pathogens with enhanced pandemic potential. And so that's the new term of art. So what is gain of function? So gain of function is a really unfortunate term. And I think everybody agrees that it was not a really good one, because it was created to describe the gain of transmissibility and pathogenicity in some experiments done with H5N1 avian influenza over a decade ago now. And it was described in an advisory board meeting of the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, or NSAB, as potential gain of function experiments, and that kind of stuck. And it's unfortunate because gain of function, loss of function, I mean, that's about reducing variables in scientific research. And that's what scientists do, right? You want to know that the thing that you're changing is the thing that's actually causing an effect. So you're trying to look for gains of function and losses of function. So it doesn't make sense when you try out this term on other people. So it's become this very specialized term of art, because we don't care about most functions being gained or lost. We can care about the transmissibility and pathogenicity. And so I think some of this new terminology may be more specific and helpful in narrowing that scope. It's also become very unfortunate that gain of function has become this political term of art. And when you have people, talking about it as if like it just becomes a substitute for science or advances in biology or anything like that. And it just is, it's unfortunate that it's become that way, because it precludes a serious conversation.
Mm-hmm. So it's not really the term that's being used in these policy documents that we'll get further into, like, okay.
Well, there is not a single mention of gain of function in the new Biden administration policy.
Mm-hmm. And, there are others, dual use research of concern and enhanced, EPPP. So
So dual use, like for lots of other people, you think, oh, good, it's got two uses, great, that's important. But actually, in this context, it means that it's legitimate research that's done for good purposes that could be misused. And so the dual use research of concern has extra language that says that it can be immediately misapplied. and or it's directly applicable for misuse, not just like, thinking about big picture, like, well, what if somebody misused this thing and add 10 steps in like a 20 year R&D program, and then it could be misused. It's actually trying to give some immediacy to it.
Great. Did anyone else have anything to add, Raina?
Yeah, look, I guess dual use has a broader application to all of science, and it's the concept that any kind of many areas of science, whether it's artificial intelligence, robotics, biology, can be used to help human beings, but can also be used to harm human beings. And it is a much broader term than just applied to biology. So I think, and it's really applied to existential threats to humanity, which is a legitimate use of that term. So I think we just have to remember it's a broader term than just about biology.
Okay. And so I guess we'll go back to Gigi for this one. As was mentioned earlier, the White House has issued this new updated policy that kind of combines two previous policies, the one on dual use research of concern, which we just discussed, enhanced potential pandemic pathogens, which now has a new acronym. And can you just tell us kind of where things stand, give us a broad overview of where things stand in terms of biosafety and biosecurity regulations here in the United States, and maybe walk us through a brief history of how these came about. Why do we have the rules and policies that we have now?
Sure. Well, it depends on how far back you want to go. There's a lot of what we have now as far as, institutional biosafety committees and having your research reviewed and all of that comes from the early days of genetic engineering and the much famed Asilomar conference in the early 70s, where people said, okay, these are the rules of the road. This is what we're going to do. And we want to make sure that that this is safe before continuing in molecular biology. Since then, of course, there are a lot of regulations, and this is something that is important to look at because it adds to burden, and we want to make sure that the regulations are doing something. And so there's a lot of regulations on pathogen access and use, and all of these have good intentions. And we want you to have good control over knowing what's in your lab, what's going on in your lab, that people are well trained, that they're using the right equipment. All of these things have, I think, good intentions. The problem is that if they're overlapping and if sometimes they don't make scientific sense, it's really hard to then turn back the clock and say, like, well, let's just start with a fresh slate. What is it that we really need here to get the information we need? And that's important. So, because it's important to make sure that we actually get a product at the end of this research. We want information, we want good science, and we want to make sure that it's not about balancing safety and productivity. It's making sure that we're doing the right things to have safety and productivity.
So if I was a smarter person than I am, and I was a scientist working at a lab that wanted to, do lack of a better term, gain of function research on a potential pandemic pathogen. Tell me about the levels of kind of oversight or review that I would encounter to do that.
Well, it's too bad. Susan would have been a better person to ask about some of these issues because, my days of high containment are a little bit behind me. But the idea of, you have, like, it depends on what you're doing. If you're working with a regulated pathogen, you have to yourself be cleared. You have to have your laboratory inspected and cleared, everybody who's working on it. And that process goes through CDC and DOJ. To have a specific experiment like the recent policy, if you are intending, and I don't have all the details, so Jamie, if they're more top of mind, please jump in. That there is a role for the institution in what experiments you propose. And for many experiments, they will only be reviewed at that institutional level and at the funder level. So that could be NIH. But for some experiments that would be considered, a narrow group of experiments, they would also then need to have departmental review. So that would be the Department of Health and Human Services if you were funded by NIH. They tried to bound it really tightly so that it would not be a routine thing to have federal department review, because that would be very slow. And it did give the secretary the power to waive those restrictions if, for example, there was a lot of urgent work that needed to be done on H5N1 in cows, and we needed to have that information, yesterday. Those rules could be waived, and probably, because there would be a lot of attention to the experiments being proposed anyway. So, there is a process to try and both have reasonable review and also safety in mind. There's also, and I think this is really important, a process for if there is a result that was unexpected, that falls into that category, that you would stop work and have that review process kick in. And I think that's really important because, you wouldn't do research if you knew what the answer was. And so I think that it's important to have something for that element of surprise, because that's what a lot of groundbreaking research is finding out things that you weren't expecting.
Thank you. And Jamie, to kind of follow on that, Gigi alluded to some of these, regulated agents. I think that's the select agents, this group of pathogens that the CDC and the U.S. Department of Agriculture have rules for. There are other places where there's oversight and regulation, such as at the level of the institution, the institutional biosafety committees. There are U.S. regulators, funding agencies, PIs. Everyone has some responsibilities and is subject to some forms of oversight. So if you could kind of talk a little bit about that, that would
Sure.
be very helpful.
Yeah, so I'll jump to the sort of division of roles and responsibilities in a moment, but I just wanted to build on what Gigi was saying about this new guidance, that the new policy on dual use research of concern and research with enhanced pandemic pathogens. There's so many acronyms and they're constantly changing. It's really hard to keep up. But basically those, and I'll just kind of add a little bit more sort of summary of sort of what that is and how that changed the game, and then I'll talk about roles and responsibilities. So basically, it combines a few existing policies that date back to 2012 that were sort of fragmented and maybe perhaps not always consistent with each other, and also incomplete, didn't really cover the full space. So they tried to integrate it, make it all make sense as one holistic sort of set of policies, and then also expand the scope so it's more comprehensive and appropriate to the scale of the challenge. And there are basically two categories. One is category 1 research, which Gigi was just mentioning, which just gets reviewed at the funding agency level. And that's basically kind of a continuation of the earlier DIRC policy, where there's a list of agents, it has to involve a pathogen that's on the list of agents, and it has to involve some, one of 9 experiments of concern. And if it meets those criteria, then it's considered category 1. The scope is an expansion of the scope that was true under the existing DIRC policy. There's a much longer list of pathogens that are considered, and the list of experiments of concern is somewhat refined. The second category, which is category 2, where Gigi was saying, this is a bigger deal. It goes up to a higher level review, not just the funding agency, but the department. That's category 2. And that's, instead of a list-based approach, that's a risk-based approach. So the idea is, like, it doesn't really matter what goes into the research, but if the outcome is some sort of enhanced pandemic pathogen that has the potential to spread quickly among humans and would be moderately to severely virulent, then that meets the criteria, and there are lots of different ways to get there. And so that is, that's the second piece, and that's kind of if you look at the history, that's a continuation of the P3CO policy that was produced by the Obama administration, I think in 2017. Okay, so who does what? So the main areas of responsibility lie with the government funding departments and agencies and the PI and their institutions. So the departments and agencies don't just include HHS and NIH, it also includes any department or agency that's funding research that meets those criteria. So it's going to expand in scope. It will probably include USDA and others. Within the agencies, they have to have sort of review bodies internally to like evaluate the research and whether or not it meets category 1 or 2 criteria. Likewise, the PI, when they're submitting their proposal, needs to decide whether it meets category 1 or 2 criteria. And then if the process goes forward, there needs to be an institutional research entity within the university or what have you that will also evaluate those claims. And the idea is like, I think the White House is trying to make use of the considerable bandwidth across the research enterprise and also to distribute shared responsibility for making these determinations. So this is actually achievable in practice. I think, I'm very encouraged by this. I think they did a good job trying to thread the needle between like proper oversight that's meaningful from a biosafety and biosecurity perspective without unduly burdening the research enterprise. But I think where we're going to have to see how it goes. I think there's going to have to be a lot of building capacity, both within the departments and agencies and within academic research institutes, to actually bring together groups of people, have the salient expertise. I agree with Gigi, you need to have the right experts around the table to make these determinations. But there are going to be a lot more places that need to do this evaluation process than before, and that capacity is not in place. So we're going to have to build that capacity. I'll just make one more point, which is like, we should also think more expansively. It's not just about US government regulations. There's the funding stage, there's the oversight stage, but there's this whole life cycle of bioscience research, development, and commercialization. And there are non-governmental entities that have like certain controls over the process that have an opportunity to do meaningful intervention. And it's not all governed by regulation, nor should it. Providers of goods and services, for example, people who sell DNA have an opportunity to decide whether they're going to sell an order to a customer and whether that customer should have that material. There are publishers of journals that decide whether or not to publish an article and disseminate publicly the information that is revealed through the research. That's an important consideration. And then there are also non-federal funders of research in the United States and internationally that aren't covered by these guidelines, and we need to figure out a way to cover that. Some of them have already started to think about doing that voluntarily. We are working on a project at NTI in cooperation with CEPI to really accelerate progress in like getting private funders to take the same kind of responsibilities that the US government is taking.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, yeah, so I think there's a lot of room for, it's a good step forward, but there's a lot of room for additional work to continue to drive progress.
Great. And Gigi, looks like you have something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Jamie's, because it's so important to think internationally. One of the big criticisms that there was a proposal that had that made the recent administration announcement necessary. That an advisory board, the NSAB, had proposed some rules for virology research, and they ended up having a request for information, and the result was this policy that was just released. And one of the reasons I think it's really important to think about, we want to export these norms. We want to have really good safety oversight. We want to have good research oversight that makes sense, that can be just as effective in any country that it could be incorporated in. And that was something that, for better or for worse, what happened in Asilomar in the 70s, when thinking about this new frontier of biological sciences, the system that we created ended up being emulated around the world. And so, I would like to see us come to something that not only influences how research is done here in the US, but that has a way to, increase the safety and security of research around the world in a productive way. And so we are all kind of operating on adding to good norms. And so the kind of non-governmental organizations that Jamie just mentioned, including, you didn't mention IBIS, which is another great example of this. this is something that so we can all be adding together, because you're not going to have just one system. We're not all going to listen to one organization internationally that's going to tell us how research should be done. We want to have lots of patchwork stuff that is all swimming in the same direction, just to throw like 5 metaphors together.
Great. Well, we love acronyms and metaphors in this business, so
Can I just chime in on this international piece? So Gigi, I really appreciate you mentioning IBIS. We're so excited. We launched IBIS in February at the Munich Security Conference, and it is really meant to sort of address this international issue. I think that there are, the United States still has room to improve on oversight of dual use research and pandemic potential pathogens, but it is pretty forward leaning, and I think has an important leadership role to play globally. And if you look at the data, so we partnered with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and Economist Impact and published the 2nd edition of our Global Health Security Index in 2021. And there's one statistic that I think really underlines the gap that Gigi is highlighting, which is that most countries around the world do not have oversight in place for dual use research. We found in our data collection that 94% of countries do not have national level oversight systems in place for this kind of dual use research. There's a ton of work to be done. We're hoping that IBIS can help sort of share and promulgate best practices between governments. I'm hoping that this sort of template that the US government is putting forward is a model that other countries can look to as they're looking to develop their own policies. I think the United States can and is trying to advocate for this in multilateral fora like the G7 to elevate this as a priority. And then there are other capacity building programs like those. The Department of Defense has a cooperative threat reduction program, and through that can work with countries to build capacity in that area. And then finally, the United States as the largest funder, the US government is the largest funder of life science research, and through that has tremendous leverage on research that's being conducted overseas. So that's also helpful.
Okay, so just to follow on the issue of this new governmental policy on potential pandemic pathogen research and dual use research of concern, it sounds like at least 2 out of the 3 of you are have positive feelings, views on this new development. And one of the reasons, Jamie, you mentioned was that it's potentially going to expand the number of the federal agencies that review this sort of work from just the NIH to others. And then one of the problems, though, with the previous policy, the one that this will replace, is that very few studies ended up getting reviewed by this higher up body that was supposed to look at potentially risky research and weigh in on it. Just 3 over a long period of time, many years. So in that respect, how will this new policy ensure that it's capturing the kind of research modifying pathogens to potentially make them more risky, more pathogenic or transmissible? How do we make sure that this new policy will capture that kind of work so that it is reviewed by whatever agency is doing the funding and review? Jamie, do you want to take a crack?
Well, I'm keen to hear what Reina and Gigi think, but I'll just I think it's all going to, we've got the policy that the White House has shared, and now it's really about implementation. And this is why I was saying before, it depends on who's in those committees and the quality of the expertise and the seriousness with which the departments and agencies take this issue, and also the seriousness with which research institutions take this issue when they're building their own institutional review entities. So I think this is going to have to, policy is not enough. It's about building the capacity to implement this effectively and people taking it seriously.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Reina?
No, I'd like to get to some of the more interesting questions.
Okay. Gigi, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, it's one of the things about biosafety that often gets overlooked is that, you could have these policies, but really you need to have sustained investment across the board, because it's like education. I mean, you can't, just because I taught the classes I taught this year doesn't mean that I can be done teaching those classes. I have to keep teaching them because there's new people to teach. And so, you have to, it's really like a commitment that you have to have long term to building this capacity, explaining why it's needed, and giving people the tools to be able to do both, to do good science and to do it safely.
Okay. And at the risk of I apologize in advance, Raina, asking another less interesting question. Staying on this new policy, Gigi or Jamie, if you'd like to weigh in, if this had been in place in 2018, do you think that it would have made a difference in terms of, let's say hypothetically, that COVID were caused by a lab leak? Would this have captured that experiment that could have led to the pandemic, or what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I've written pretty extensively why I think that this is not a laboratory leak, and why the evidence says that it came from, I mean, it's a normal zoonotic transmission. If normal means like, to having a bunch of ill-treated animals shoved together in a spot in a place where disease is likely to spread. If that is normal, that is, and I wish, just while we're on that subject, even though it's a little bit of a digression, and I apologize to my other panelists, we are having an opportunity cost problem here, because when we're talking about like these, if SARS-CoV-2 were possibly unnatural, we are not talking about like how to actually address some of the zoonotic safety issues here, or even clinical laboratory safety issues, which are prevalent. And so there was an opportunity to maybe pressure China to have a national park system, for example, so create more buffers between bats and people, or to regulate markets and to enforce, WHO has some beautiful guidance for markets that could be implemented. All of these things are missed opportunities for safety and pandemic prevention. I'll leave it to the other panelists.
Mm-hmm. Well, so sorry, did Jamie, did you have something to add? No, okay. All right. Well then, Raina, so one of the risks of putting out new regulations on biological research could be that you stifle that research, or maybe, as Gigi alluded to, you miss opportunities to do other things that would have an impact. But could you perhaps talk a little bit about what are the potential risks of under-regulating this pandemic, potential pandemic pathogen research?
Sure. Firstly, I'd just like to reiterate that we're talking about a tiny fraction of virology research. And in this instance, the rights and the safety of the community is a greater concern than the rights of the scientists, and requires greater oversight. Secondly, I agree with Jamie and Gigi that the US has done more than any other country on safety and regulation. I mean, setting up the NSABB and, after 9/11, et cetera. No other country has done the amount that the US has done. I'd like to quickly go back to H5N1, because it's great to, get everyone anxious about H5N1. But if that virus switches receptor affinity from avian to human, and we need a human vaccine, we don't need gain of function research to create it. The process is we have to get the exact genome sequence of the virus that's causing a pandemic that's arisen in nature, and create a vaccine to match it. Creating gain of function viruses is not useful at all in terms of making vaccines. It was no use in 2009 with the H1N1 pandemic. The flu vaccines need to be exactly matched. And with mRNA technology, which is one of the greatest breakthroughs in medicine in the last 100 years, a vaccine could be ready in 6 weeks. With the old egg-based methods, 4 months. All influenza vaccine manufacturers have pre-pandemic H5 vaccines. So that allows regulatory hurdles to be overcome to rapidly get vaccines into arms. So we've got everything we need. We don't need gain of function. In fact, it's not helpful at all. The risks are, on a broader big picture level, I think biosafety is very similar to cybersecurity in that the technology has raced ahead at an exponential rate, And we are still stuck in thinking in frameworks from the last century, and it's a constant game of catch up. But I believe in biosafety, we're still a decade behind then compared to cybersecurity. So governments have become very adept at cyber threat detection, not fully successful, but more adept, and have invested considerably in it. In biosafety, we haven't even scratched the surface, and the focus to date has narrowly and solely been on error in formal documented labs. And of course, error, as Alison said in the earlier panel, is extremely common, and there are repeated examples of human error in BSL 3 and 4 labs that result in accidents. The American Biosafety Association catalogues these accidents, and it's a great weekend read if you've got nothing better to read. But we also need to look at terror and the use of this technology by nefarious actors and how that can be enabled or disabled. So in terms of research institutions and legitimate research, that's one aspect of it, but in private industry as well. So the research issue has been in focus since 2011, and really we've only focused on the rights of scientists and not the core issue of biosafety. I think we need to step back and look at the technology landscape. Look at, Ryan Noyce and David Evans, who are the virologists who created a synthetic extinct orthopox virus, very closely related to smallpox, because all the orthopox viruses only differ very, very slightly in their DNA-based pairs from each other. By synthetic biology. They wrote, and I quote, "As the memory of smallpox and polio fades, the challenge will be to educate new generations about the risks posed by these diseases. This necessitates providing ongoing support, and public health agencies will need to protect populations even from extinct epidemic diseases. The advance of technology means no disease-causing organism can forever be eradicated." So, we need to just wake up and smell the coffee. There's a lot of stuff going on. We need to step back, look at the bigger picture. So in research institutes, we can improve biosafety in a number of ways that would require major culture change. A lot of people balk against that, but it's possible. One example of such a massive culture change has occurred in clinical trials. When I first started doing research, and I've done a lot of clinical trials, there was no requirement to register a trial. You could just do a clinical trial, publish it in the New England Journal. You didn't have to publicly register it. This led to a lot of trial results being buried if they had unfavorable results. So as a result of the need to have transparency and accountability, there was a major culture change, and everybody cooperated. The journals, the funding agencies, the research institutions all came together and cooperated so that after 2008, there was a universal requirement to register trials. And if you didn't register it, you couldn't get your trial published in a reputable journal. It wouldn't get through an IRB or be supported by funding bodies. And this is a great example of how it is possible to achieve quantum change in culture, in research. But it does require all parties to come together and agree that, and I'm in favor of a public registry of EPPP research for transparency and accountability, and I believe it could be achieved. But we also need to create unambiguous methods to screen research to see if it is EPPP. And at the moment, even from this discussion, we can see it's ambiguous. Everyone doesn't agree on what the definitions are. So that's a big piece of work that still needs to be done. When you submit research to an IRB, if you're doing research on ionizing radiation or genomic research or collection of human biospecimens, there's a whole lot of criteria. You've got to go through a checklist and tick a number of boxes and disclose, whether anything raises a red flag. And we need to do the same for EPPP research. We need a structured decision framework for reviewers and researchers to ensure systematic and uniform application of the P3CO framework, and that would create a mandated pathway for reviewers to assess and refer proposals where required. And as a first step, it should be mandated that all animal and human research committees add a question on EPPP to the screening questions that we already answer around radiation, etc. And then if it is EPPP, then the proposal should undergo a systematic risk analysis in a structured approach that minimizes subjectivity and bias. We have tools for other applications that could be used for this. And that's the next step to the kind of great work that the US has done in terms of regulation. Finally, just to say, regulation of private industry, synthetic biology is a self-regulated industry, and self-regulation is great. We love it in medicine. Doctors love to regulate themselves. Police love to regulate themselves. It's so great. You know, we don't like being regulated by other people, but the stakes are much higher with SynBio, right? We're not talking, you know, if the police regulate themselves over misconduct, it's not going to cause the collapse of society, right? You might get one rogue cop free to run around doing whatever they're doing. But if we make a mistake with self-regulation of synthetic biology, we could end up with an existential threat. The other thing is that hostile states or non-state actors can easily conduct a Trojan horse attack by ostensibly making some harmless product like a COVID test, setting up a biotech, but actually be running a biolab. And the Reedley lab incident is a very shocking example of an undocumented lab in California and a very poor response by authorities, unless what we're being told publicly is not actually what happened. But, you know, that was just a code enforcement officer noticed a hose sticking out of a building in Reedley, and she reported it. It took 3 months for anything to happen. You know, and a pandemic pathogen can cause a pandemic in much less time than 3 months. The authorities were very slow to respond. Nobody was interested. And there was material, according to public reports, there was material labeled Ebola and other really serious pathogens in that lab, humanized mice, which were none of that was necessary to make COVID tests, which is what they were doing. And apparently it was all thrown out, wasn't tested. So I think the US needs to take a good hard look at how they're going to respond, how they're going to document illegal or undocumented labs, and look for it is a national security issue because and if a US biotech went to China and set up a company to launch an attack on China, that'd get picked up straight away. You wouldn't be able to do it. But the US is like a free-for-all. So I think that's a big part of it that is a glaring gap for intelligence agencies to deal with.
So given the advance in technology and, you know, how this lab cropped up kind of under the radar, there aren't tight enough regulations on potentially risky research, is your view?
It's not just regulations, but you need threat detection as well. And, you know, police and law enforcement have been using AI methods to detect signals or flags for planned terrorist attacks, looking at chatter online and that kind of stuff, using big data. And you can bring in, you know, government agency can bring in both open source and non-open source data using AI methods to easily create warning signals for some kind of nefarious activity. And I just think we're way behind in that. And the US is obviously quite good at that in some other fields like terrorism, but not. I think there's a way to go with biosecurity.
And so Gigi, kind of the opposite question. We heard from Reina that, you know, kind of not adequate threat detection and inadequate or patchwork regulations present a risk of something going awry. What are the risks of over-regulating EPP research?
Sure. Well, I think just to take a little bit of a step back, I mean, it's important to, I think we all agree that biological issues are a national security imperative, and it's important to look out for the potential misuse, to be able to attribute any disease event, to make sure that you can quickly run it down to be natural or not. I think that is really underway. And Reina mentioned clinical trials and how they're registered. I think, you know, we've proposed a similar thing for gene drives, so that if anyone were to release any sort of gene drive into the environment, that you would have a registry of this. And, you know, there's some things that you can do like that are great. The problem is with some of this research, it is extraordinarily complex. And to be able to, the reason we're having trouble saying, like, you know, specifically that this should always be regulated in this particular way, and you can have simple guidance versus the 84-page implementation guidance of the policy that just came out, is because this is extraordinarily complex, and we're talking about it at a high level, but when you're actually looking at the scientific research itself, it is much more, I don't know, it is just much more contextual. Are we talking about human cells that we're working with, or mice, or what other, I mean, there's lots of other things. It's a very complex topic. So it's, and also we're not doing the same thing over and over again. We're actually trying to uncover new knowledge. And so I think it makes research more complex to regulate than some, police proceedings, or even cyber warfare, where you have people actually attacking you and you're trying to defend yourself. And also computers have generally similar immune systems as opposed to people. So there's a lot that's different in this particular spot. I would also say that, biosafety is not something that we can just think about when it comes to these kinds of research, this kind of research. I mentioned clinical trials earlier. I've visited labs, all over the world, and low resource, high resource, and generally people try to do the best things that they can, but I don't think we're spending enough time thinking about how we should be helping low resource labs and making sure that they have the equipment that they need to protect themselves. We are talking about some very specialized labs that are already trying to do their best when it comes to safety. Meanwhile, I have seen in clinical labs in West Africa where, laboratorians are opening plates and smelling them to be able to diagnose disease, which is a very acceptable way that, to be able to actually do that, but not the best way for the safety of the person, smelling the plates. So I think we need to think about biosafety not just in this particular area, but generally, and try to give people the tools that they can to be able to do their work safely. And because, it's one thing when when you're doing an experiment that could potentially be dangerous or risky. It's another thing when you have no idea what's coming over the transom from a clinical sample and you want to identify it. So I think, these are different aspects of biosafety, but it's really important that we not lose sight of the majority of the work that's going on.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think we agree that we want to take the right balance, not overregulate or underregulate. And I think the way, in terms of the risks, I would like the way I would just define it crisply is like there are three different things we're worried about. We're worried about accidental release of some kind of pathogen that spreads, widely among human populations or other populations and causes significant health problems and other associated problems, which is, related to biosafety. And I think this community has been thinking about this for decades. And I think that there's a considerable expertise and capacity to deal with those risks, but we're still evolving our thinking, and that's a work in progress. I think the area that is more neglected is the biosecurity piece, and that's specifically thinking about how to guard against exploitation by malicious actors of the deliberate research enterprise. And the exploitation could take a couple approaches. One is getting stuff, goods, materials, services from the legitimate enterprise and using it to do bad things or to gain knowledge that was once, tacit and is now widely available. And sometimes it's referred to as a quote info hazard, right? And so if you can think concretely about what the risk pathways are, then you can think really concretely about what are the most meaningful interventions that you can offer along the path to prevent that from happening or at least reduce the risk. And so I would say like biosafety and biosecurity, like any intervention you provide, in my view, is never going to 100% eliminate risk. I think we just have to think about a layered defense and figure out what are the biggest holes in the system and what are the most practical, effective ways to plug them. I think the new the White House guidance is an important piece of that, but we have more work to do. Including the private funders and private research, which I mentioned earlier. I mean, certainly we want to think about expanding this approach to philanthropic donors and venture capital, because that's a growing part of the research enterprise in the United States and internationally that US government guidelines aren't going to touch. And I think, I'm actually, when I think about synthetic biology, I'm actually quite encouraged because that, I mean, I just went to the SynBioBeta conference in San Jose last week, which has a lot of industry present. And there's a lot of conversation about biosecurity, and that community actually takes it quite seriously. Not everyone is on the same page, but I would say they've been pretty forward-leaning for a while. And, one of the ways to think about, it's not just like you start with regulation. Sometimes the community needs to figure out what does you even do that provides a meaningful protection. A lot of it is really complex, and you need to do a lot of work to figure out what's the right tool that balances allowing the research to go forward while still ensuring against risks. And so DNA synthesis screening is like an important example of that. There have been US government policy that's been developed in parallel with technical solutions. And as the community has figured out on a voluntary basis how to police itself, over time, the US government and other governments have an opportunity to make that more and more incentivized and required. And so I think, I'm optimistic that there are like meaningful solutions we can put on the table to plug these biggest holes in the system. I'm really encouraged to see the US government has put this new policy in place. I think the DNA synthesis screening guidance and implementation framework are really encouraging. I think parts of industry really want to lean forward, and we just need to keep on chipping away at it. And the last thing I'll say is, we're talking a lot about virology research and pandemic potential pathogens. But we also need to think about the sort of advances in tech that are basically, have the benefit of democratizing access to these capabilities, but also in the same breath are in growing risks. How do we safeguard these new tools like AI bio capabilities, distributed DNA synthesis capabilities, other approaches to automation? So we have to think about this in a very modern, evolving way and make sure that our policies keep up with advances in tech.
Thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one
sorry, Matt, we're actually out of time. We are at 4.
Okay.
All right. Sorry to barge in here. Well, I want to thank all the panelists and Jamie on your last note on the AI and biosafety. I think that's super interesting, and we're thinking of doing some work in this space. So I want to thank all the panelists and all the speakers today for the very thoughtful debate, thoughtful discussion. As you can see, a lot of disagreement, a lot of strong opinions, but I think it's very, very important to have these kinds of discussions in a forum like this, respectful discussions, and to look at all the different aspects of these really, really highly important issues for all of us. For the audience members, I want to thank you for sticking so long with us. I know it was a long event, a bit typically longer than what we usually do. And please stay tuned for follow-up work that we are potentially planning on these topics. Thank you very much, everyone.